You're listening to Tehachapod with Key Budge, Corey Costello, and Greg Garrett.
It's Tehachapod time again. Key Budge, Corey Costello today. Greg's away from the office. Corey, how are you?
I'm doing well. Happy to be back. Do this again.
It's nice. We're continuing to grow the show, and now we're actually seen on some digital displays that are around town at some of the stores that have the Loops digital network. We are being featured there.
I need to tell the story about that commercial real quick, though, the video shoot. Because, they came in, they shot us here in our little studio / Key's office doing the show. They came back with a couple edits of the video. It came out great. The Loop did an awesome job, and we're all over town now in Tehachapi, and you can check it out, Loop Digital Network locations. And
they're throughout the greater Tehachapi area, so that's great. And if you heard a new voice, that is our guest, Dan Bronson. Dan, welcome to Tehachapod.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you here. You're an author. You've been a part of Hollywood for many years. You've also been an educator, which I thought was fascinating, that transition from being a professor at a university to move to Hollywood. That's not the normal process, but I think that you've ended up here in Tehachapi as you've had an opportunity to work throughout Hollywood, and we're going to dive into all of those things. But before we do, we want to remind everyone that Dan is going to be featured at the Bear Valley Springs Cultural Arts Center. You're going to have a chance to talk with the community on October 23rd.
About my transition from the academic world to the world of Hollywood.
It's going to be fascinating. When I started diving into some of your background and looking, it was like, wow. From where you've been, where you were educated, the things that you were doing to all of a sudden to come to Hollywood, I don't think I could have ever explored that myself.
Yeah, but people, I think, don't give themselves enough credit. I mean, we all have various interests. I certainly do. I've certainly come from a different world. You've come from a different world.
That's true.
Right? And just when sometimes you hit on something else and you awaken this other side of your mind that you never used, and you go, wow, that was me when I started to work in government. I kind of knew some of this stuff, but then when I really started getting that knowledge, and then that a whole different side of my brain opened up, and so I think there's a lot of different roles people can play that they don't realize.
Before I even ask you, first question, let's just bring in a few of the credits that are associated with you throughout, because when I read it, I go, you've got to be kidding. You've worked Die Hard with a Vengeance, Godfather 3, Young Sherlock Holmes, Top Gun, Pretty in Pink, Witness, Death of a Cheerleader, and we could continue to roll on the different projects that you've been around, worked with, whether in the writing phase or whatever the aspect that you were doing for the film business. It's just amazing. I recognize all of these names, and it was like, oh my gosh. So let's talk a little bit about, your life and history, and what were you doing before you came to Hollywood?
I was a tenured associate professor of English at DePauw University in the Midwest, and I had never had a course in film, but I'd grown up irradiated by film, I think, while I was still in the womb. My mother was a huge, huge movie fan. I was the same, and when I got to DePauw, they had something called the winter term, and you were allowed to teach whatever you wanted, whether you had any qualifications whatsoever. I had none. I'd never had a course in film, but I was in love. So I offered an intro film course, teaching myself film as I was teaching it to the students. And usually you could have 5 or 6 students in one of these things because the topics were usually so esoteric. I had 125.
Wow.
And I eventually used those enrollments to convince my very conservative faculty colleagues to bring film into the regular curriculum. And I eventually got a grant from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences to bring a director by the name of Lamont Johnson to campus. He was probably the top television movie director. He'd done The Execution of Private Slovic that certain summer, My Sweet Charlie. I just on and on and on. And we hit it off. I'd never seen this guy before. He'd never seen me. He got off the plane with 350 other people, and we walked right to each other. Took him over to the local bar, and we were immediately arguing about the movies. Anyhow, everything that could go wrong did go wrong, but I'd always managed to pull it out of the toilet at the last minute. And at the end of the whole thing, he said, "Dan, come to Hollywood." We had this incredible radio voice because he was the top radio actor in New York during the war. He was disabled, and that meant that he got to stay home and perform. At any rate, "Come to Hollywood. I see you as a successful producer in 5 years." Well, it took a little longer than that, but I got a grant from the Lilly Endowment to go to Hollywood under the auspices of George Seaton, director of Miracle on 34th Street and The Country Girl. And I arrived, and unfortunately George was dying. Wonderful, wonderful man. I'd had a long correspondence with him. I met him literally on his deathbed for about 5 minutes. He arranged for me to meet the man who bought the studio for Lew Wasserman, a guy I'm convinced they modeled the shark in Jaws after. And he's one tough customer, and he said, "You got to pass the studio. You're on your own, kid. It's up to you." So I got together with the editor of the story department. Well, first Verna Fields, who was Spielberg's mentor. She was the editor of Jaws, and everyone called her Mother Cutter. And Verna, she was delightful. She got me assigned to a picture called The Last Married Couple in America with George Segal and Natalie Wood. I learned every aspect of the movie business. I was there in the editing room when they wouldn't even let the director in. I mean, it was just a great, great experience. And in the meantime, I got to know the head of the story department. He offered me a job. I resigned my tenured professorship to accept that job, only to find there was something called the Story Analyst Guild that didn't want me to have that job, because you had to be a member of the guild in order to have a job, but you had to have a job in order to be a member of the guild. So after having had the most secure position on the face of the earth, tenured professorship, I was introduced to the realities of Hollywood. I was 4 or 5 months basically homeless, house sitting, living on peanut butter and bananas, and $10 a week that I had earned from writing a current biography article about Marty Ritt, whom I later met, and who told me it was his favorite piece about himself.
What year is this?
A long time ago. I will date myself. It was, 1978 and 79.
Okay. All right. That puts me in a frame of mind where I was at. Well, and being able to relate to the movies that were coming out that time.
Probably still in the crib.
No. I was in high school.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I think that point though that you just brought up, and that was the first thing that I caught. You go from having the most secure position. I mean, tenured professor. People don't give up tenure, right? They want tenure, and then they're good. They can cruise, but you just decided, I mean, that obviously shows a passion for the movies, a little bit of belief in yourself, a lot probably, and to be able to, I mean, your mindset at that point to give up and then, give up this tenured spot to go to Hollywood, like that's a big step of faith.
My parents were probably having nervous breakdowns, but I was totally unaware. I was thinking, this is great. One of the places I house said, Gene Wilder called, oh gosh, it went on and on. It was a story supervisor, and she kept getting these calls, and I was there sitting in the house for her, so I got to talk to all these celebrities. This is so much fun. Close to starving to death. I think I was as slender as I've ever been, but eventually I managed to talk I went to the story editor and said, "Okay, it's time for you to do something about this." And he got on the phone to the head of the story analyst and says, "Okay, it's time for you to do something about it." And they did.
So now that takes place, and then what transpires, and where do you go from there now that you're in?
Well, I was not only in, I was very quickly the top story analyst, and the story editor called me into his office and said, "Look, I'm about to be promoted to executive level, and I'm going to make you the next story editor." And then the actor struck. And everything was fine until they picketed the tour. And the tour brings more money in, well, in those days it did. It brings more money into Universal than any of their movies. And Lew Wasserman shut the whole studio down. Yeah. And I was suddenly out of work
Yeah.
once again.
Yeah. My dad was a film technician at Universal. Yeah. And I remember the strikes, and that industry has its peaks and valleys, let's just say. And it always seemed to come around the holiday time, there'd be that little card that said, we're going through layoffs. And I remember, being a part of him being a part of the union, and that was a part of that annual thing. And then waiting for that phone call. Okay, we've got so many projects that are rolling, and we need you back.
Yeah. Well, it was a great introduction to the realities of Hollywood, to the roller coaster ride that it is for almost everyone. That's a little bit what my Confessions of Hollywood Nobody is all about. We've all read the books about the big successes, but this is a book about the rest of them.
Yeah.
About the ones who keep the town going with very little recognition and who live with constant insecurity. I was back to peanut butter and bananas again, but I had made friends with a fellow at the Directors Guild. He was close friends with George Cukor, one of the great directors of all time, the guy who really directed Gone with the Wind. He was fired at the last minute when they brought Gable on because he was homosexual. He was a woman's director, but the women all went to his house at night to get their instructions for the next day. Anyhow, fascinating guy. And I got a call from him. The phone rings, and I'd warned that he might be calling. And he was quite a character. Mr. Bronson, George Cukor here. Are you, David Shepard may have told you that I'm thinking of writing my autobiography. I'd like to call it The Greatest Story Ever Told, but I understand someone's used that title. Are you a good writer, Mr. Bronson? And I said, I'm a great writer. A great director deserves a great writer. Oh, very good, very good. But if you're not, I shall find you out. Well, I ended up in wonderful discussions with this man at his legendary home. He'd entertained everyone in Hollywood at this place. He had this home up on a hill above Doheny, and a swimming pool down below, which was the model for the swimming pool in Marilyn Monroe's last unfinished picture, the one where all the nude shots were done. And down in the corner is this little guest house, and that's where Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn conducted their decades-long affairs. It was a thrill to be there. But then he got rich and famous, in the movie Rich and Famous, and I got a job as associate story editor at Filmways. So it was up and down and back and forth for a long, long while. Eventually, I became executive editor of a story editor, Paramount Pictures. That was a glorious ride. Oh, it also ended. Everything in Hollywood ends,
right?
And they're very rarely happy endings. What happened was Jeffrey Katzenberg and Michael Eisner, who were the top, two of the top dogs at Paramount, decided to go to Disney, and the other boys decided to follow Barry Diller over to Fox, and suddenly I got promoted because they took their people with them. I had an extraordinary experience. We had this Dawn Steele, who was actually the first female head of a studio. This is a little later on. She was a screamer. She screamed at everyone. I got summoned to her office, and I thought, oh, God, what did I do now? And I went in, and she says, Dan, what do you want? We want you to stay at Paramount forever. What do you want? I thought, what? Nice. So I told her I wanted to be executive story editor, and I wanted a screenwriting deal. And she agreed, but then she didn't give me the screenwriting deal. And that's when I got a call from Jeffrey Katzenberg, who said he'd read this spec script that I had done. He loved it, didn't want to make it. Typical Jeffrey. But he loved it. I'm still was I still interested in writing? I said, sure. So there ensued months of negotiation over a 3-picture deal at Disney. And then I got this call from another executive, a good friend of mine, David Kirkpatrick, who said, the title of the project that was going to be my first Disney project was Blood Money. Blood Money, Blood Money. He said, the word is out all over the street. Everyone knows you're going to Disney. He said, but it's all right. I'll fix things with Dawn. And he did. It wasn't 2 minutes later that I was summoned to Dawn's office again. She fired me on the spot. She told me that I'd never work in town again. And I knew that I had at last arrived. Do you hear those words?
Right,
they're almost music to your ears.
Now, had you been writing all your life? Is this something that once you came to Hollywood that you started to write your screenplays? And
it's interesting. When I was in 6th or 7th grade, I was a huge science fiction fan. Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, Clarke, all of those people. I wrote the world's worst science fiction novel, or at least some chapters. I was just beyond dreadful. And then I took creative writing at Pomona College, where I sat alongside a guy named Jeffrey Fiskin, who has long credits. He did Revenge. He did, well, most recently, he's still working. He's my age, and he's still working. He was one of the executive producers and writers on Bosch.
Which actually had an episode filmed in Tehachapi in front of the Tehachapi Police Department. And their next to last season, or third to last season, was shot here. Yeah. A piece of it was shot here.
Yeah.
You were part of the story.
So Jeffrey, he looked like, I hated him. He looked like a writer, and God, could he write. And I was terrible. I was probably the worst writer in the class, but I was so serious about what I was doing, they took pity upon me. My lowest grades came in creative writing. I got B-. I probably deserved D's, but they just took pity upon me. So I thought, well, if I can't do it, I'll teach it. The typical kind of thing. And I didn't attempt to write anything aside from the occasional review while I was teaching. I taught the novel for 10 years, never tried to write a novel. When I got to Hollywood, within 2 months, I was collaborating on a screenplay. I'd obviously found my medium, and I've been at it pretty much ever since.
So what is we kind of get what story editors maybe do, but can you explain to folks what the sort of story analyst, story editor, what are some of those roles? What's some of the day-to-day of that sort of stuff?
Well, there is... at every studio, or at least there was. Things have changed very, very dramatically in recent years with the advent of streaming movies and miniseries. But in those days, every studio had something called the creative group, and these were vice presidents and presidents production. They're the ones who choose the films that get made and then supervise their production. People submit screenplays to them for consideration. They also commission screenplays. When a screenplay is submitted to one of them, they send it to the story department, which is presided over by the story editor. He doesn't really assign. He's got a bunch of readers, story analysts, and one among them will read whatever's just come into an executive. They'll write like a 3 or 4 paragraph summation, a comment, and give it a box score for dialogue, production value, plot line, characterization, and then a recommendation. Consider, pass, and every once in a while, let's make this movie. I can't remember the official designation, but very rarely, very, very rarely. It goes back to the executive, and then he gets on the phone to whoever submitted it and pretends to have read it himself. As a matter of fact, I know of at least one case where a producer bought a screenplay without ever having read it. I had turned his son onto this screenplay by no one, totally unrecognized name, John McTiernan, who later went on to do things like Die Hard and Red October. And he read it and loved it as much as I did. And he went to visit his father, who'd done some 70 films at that point in time. There it was, Nomads, sitting on his father's desk. And he says, "You've got Nomads." And his father says, "Yeah, is it any good?" He says, "Oh, it's great." And Elliot got on the phone at that moment and bought his way into Nomads. So the word in Hollywood is nobody reads.
Yeah.
Nobody. And the joke, of course, is because they can't. And that's probably true of some of these executives, but they can't because they don't have the time. So they rely on these story departments. And this is the way it works. Yeah. Well, I once lectured for a friend at UCLA about this very thing. And I was on the docket with a very well-known member of the Writers Guild. And he said, "Well, what Dan says is generally true, but some of us reach a point in our career where we can demand that the executive we're submitted to read it himself." Well, just last week, I gave something to Tom Mount, who was head of production at Universal, and he got back to me the very next day. And I don't know where I found the restraint. I didn't tell him that I had read his screenplay. Oh, no. It was a rush that came to me overnight because it was important enough to get back to quickly. So that's the way it works.
Was there? I got to ask this follow up though. Were there ever with the ones you read, either one that maybe another studio made and you went, I can't believe they made that, or something that maybe you all passed on and someone made and became a hit? Were there a couple that you couldn't believe, I guess, on either end of the spectrum?
Oh yeah. I will. Everyone who's done this work has examples of that. I passed on The Karate Kid. It did not have Ralph Macchio. It did not have the wonderful Sensei.
Right, yeah.
And it on the page just lay flat. But it got a great director and it got a great couple of stars and it worked.
Right.
There's Frank Price, who was head of Columbia for a long. Well, it's a great scandal. He's the one who was stealing from his own producers and actors. At any rate, he had passed on E.T. in order to do Starman. So
there's always that story, right?
Yeah, invariably. I mean, sometimes you'll pass on something you yourself personally love because you know that either it's not the kind of film that your studio is going to be willing to make, or it's not the kind of thing that's going to have much of an audience.
I could see though, like reading The Karate Kid on paper, and would just be like, it's a story about a kid from New Jersey comes to the valley and like karate, like, and then even in that point in the 80s, like, what's karate? And it really wasn't a thing. And that movie in 1984, right, became this giant cult classic, and they're making even more money off of it today with the streaming series that's followed up. But yeah, I could see on paper, and it was right. It was the right director, it was the right actor and actors that made that movie what it was. It really probably, a flat paper, it wasn't a great story.
Well, I thank you.
I'm bailing you out here. I'm bailing. I mean, it's made $1 kajillion. I'm just saying.
And I remember in college taking a class that was literature and the movie adaptation of the book. And we would compare, contrast, and there was the amount of change that takes place from the original written form that gets published to where it ends up on the silver screen. It's amazing. It almost seems like sometimes they're not the same book. It's a completely different adaptation of what was originally created.
Well, Hitchcock used to say that you can't make a great movie out of a great book. You need a second or third rate book. Psycho is a perfect example. It's a piece of crap. It's unreadable, and yet it's a masterpiece of a film. So you never know. Now, I will say, to my credit, I got this thing on my desk called Home. Called Home. And I read it, and I was just blown away. And I went into the story editor. I was an analyst at that point in time. And I said, well, I may just have committed professional suicide. I've recommended a love story between a tough city cop and an Amish woman.
Witness.
Witness, exactly.
Nice.
And it became a huge, huge hit. And I turned down Blue Velvet saying this. The whole movie was on the page. Oh my God, it was so brilliant. You saw everything as you turned the page. It was fantastic. And I said to the same story editor, this is a great, great film. There's no way we're going to make it here at Paramount. It'll probably have a cult audience, but we don't have a specialized division. There were some studios that were beginning to look at these smaller films. What Hollywood wants is the huge hit, the mega hit, and the mega budget film, unfortunately, at the same time.
Yeah.
So another time I had recommended Crazy, which was the Patsy Cline story. It's by Bob Getchell, who wrote Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, a bunch of terrific screenplays. It was his finest screenplay. It was extraordinary. And I'd recommended it at Universal, and then when I ended up at Paramount, I recommended it again, and they turned it down both places. But then I got a call from Bernie Schwartz, the producer of The Coal Miner's Daughter, who was trying to replicate the hit that he'd had there. And he asked me if I would give him permission to show my coverage. That's what this work is, to Jessica Lange. And she read it, committed to making the film on the basis, not of the script, but of my coverage. So I was very proud of that one. I got to see a lot of extraordinary work. I saw The Lords of Discipline in manuscript form a year and a half, 2 years before it actually showed up as an incredible bestseller. That kind of thing happened a lot.
And you've written 2 books yourself that are out and that are on Amazon. And one you briefly mentioned was your memoir, if you will, a few years back, and that's Confessions of a Hollywood Nobody. What brought you to decide to go from the screenplays that you've worked with to say, you know what, I'm going to write a book. The stories. I mean, you can tell stories all day. I know that we're just scratching the surface on some of these stories, and we haven't even asked you about some of the characters that are in Hollywood. You know, the people that, you know, the TMZ stories, if you will, today. But I'm fascinated because writing a screenplay is one thing, and like you said, that was the medium that you've come to, and now writing a book is something completely different. As close as it is, it's still words on a page, but this is different.
Very different. Very different. Why did I turn to books? The color of my hair. I'm too old for Hollywood. It's a young person's game, and every once in a while there's someone like my friend Friskin who manages to survive to a ripe old age, still active in the town, but things dried up overnight for me, and this is not unusual. And most of the stars live in fear of that moment. They're terrified of the moment that it all goes away. Well, it all went away for me. I ended up, after writing Death of a Cheerleader, just about the hottest thing in Movies of the Week. And that's when Movies of the Week disappeared almost overnight, replaced by reality TV. What had happened, this was in the late 90s, there was the threat of a year-long writer's strike. I had lived through a year-long writer's strike.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was a threat of this, and the studios were trying to figure out what the hell they were going to do without writers, and they came up with the idea of reality TV. And it was so cheap and so successful that they forgot all about Movies of the Week at that point in time. And I went from being one of the hottest people in town to someone who could get arrested. So I'd been very, very close to some big features. McTiernan was going to make a science fiction thing that I'd written for him, and that fell through at the last minute. I retired to Bear Valley Springs. I'm living up there on the mountain, and I still have that compulsion to write. My kids, I don't know if they've ever seen anything I wrote or ever actually read anything I wrote. I know what I'll do. I'll write a memoir for them. And of course, it sort of spiraled into something much larger. And I didn't intend to write a comedy, but I guess my life is a comedy. Yeah. And I've decided, I think there might be larger interest in this. And it turned out there was. And then I took one of my best screenplays, which was unproduced, called Masquerade. It's an erotic thriller that takes place down in New Orleans in the 1920s, and used it to teach myself how to write a novel, because they're very different. Screenplays are basically dialogue and images moving across the screen. And it used to be that screenwriters didn't understand that. When I came to Hollywood, there were these big blocks of prose that you had to wade through to get to the images and to the stories. Then that John McTiernan No Bad script came across my desk, and I thought, oh my God, this guy has figured out how to write a movie, to put it on the page. And he did it by including nothing but dialogue and images. And it just flowed across the page the way the images and the sound flow across the screen. And I had to stop when I sat down to write a novel. And, wait a second, you got to go inside the character's mind. You can't do that in a screenplay, a movie. So it was a learning process. I wrote what some people consider a groundbreaking experimental novel, and what some people hate. There are no indifferent reactions to it. I haven't published it. It's sitting there. I'm trying to decide whether to send it out or not. But then I went back to something that I had been thinking of for years. I'm a slow study. I mean, my best screenplay is an adaptation of Conrad's Lord Jim. I mean, It came so close to being made so many times, I can't tell you. Didn't happen. But I wrote the first line of dialogue 10 years before I wrote the screenplay. And I had no idea. It was, "Are you a hero, Uncle? Are you a hero, Uncle?" And I had no idea where it was going to come into the story, what it had to do with anything. But 10 years later, when I sat down to do it, it was a key line. It was almost the first line of dialogue in the script. Well, back in the late 90s, as things started to fall apart, it occurred to me that it would be great fun to write a hard-boiled mystery set in Hollywood in the post-war period, which is a fascinating period of time for me, because the studios were at their peak of power, and yet they were already crumbling. The Paramount consent decrees were coming down, which divorced ownership of the studios and the distribution networks. They controlled everything in the old days. They were very, very smart. They tied up everything. They could get audiences for whatever they made because they owned the theaters as well as the studios. Well, Paramount consent decrees come along, and the government just said, "No, you can't." Well, this was a huge, huge financial blow and was the beginning of the end. At the same time, the star system began to break down. They very early figured out these stars could be a real problem. That's the reason that there was the Biograph girl. Biograph was an early studio. No one knew her name. They didn't want the audience to know the individual names of they didn't want them to know about Mary Pickford or people like that. But after a while, the names got out, and these people started getting more and more demanding and difficult, and they held them in these lockjaw contracts that were just terribly one-sided. Well, come the late 40s, the early 50s, some of these stars decided to go out on their own, where they could make much, much, much more money and have a great deal more control over their careers. They could make what they wanted to make rather than what the studio handed them. So that, too, was a huge blow. And then there was the rise of television. So it's a very, very interesting period of massive change. And change always produces conflict. And one of the things I have above my desk is conflict is drama. So it's a great period for that. And over the years, it only took me, about 20 years to actually sit down and write the thing. I decided that I wanted my hero to be an actor on the verge of great success. He makes a film that's his breakthrough movie. He's going to be a star. World War II breaks out. He volunteers. He sees D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, the freeing of the death camps. And he comes back a broken man. Scarred physically and emotionally, has a huge scar that runs all the way across his cheek to his ear. His career is over. He's reached the point where he really doesn't care. And I based him on J.D. Salinger, who saw all those things, and on, I'm having one of those senior moments, the director of Giant, and so many of the great. He was a comedy director, the greatest comedy director in Hollywood. He made the documentary footage that they used to convict the Nazis at Nuremberg, and he was never the same. He was a changed man. He made nothing but serious dramas, including The Diary of Anne Frank. Giant. I mean, he was a giant of a director. George Stevens, I knew it would come to me. His experience, and those of some others. The studio takes pity upon him. Obviously, he's not going to be a star in those days. A guy who had a scar that big across his face is not going to be a matinee idol. They made him a publicist, and his attitude is right. The only thing I know about publicity is how to suppress it, and that's his job. He has to babysit the stars and to cover up their bad behavior. And everything changes for him when he's assigned Savannah Stevens, who is the studio's sexpot star, the star of the film on which the entire studio's future depends. They've invested everything on this. And she's impossible. She goes up on her lines. She has breakdowns on the set. She sometimes doesn't show up at all. And he's the one who has to control her. Well, she disappears. He has to find her. And without the help of anyone, including the police, because no one can know, she's disappeared. Well, that's the setup, and I had a great time with it.
I don't know if for you, Corey, but I'm able to visualize.
Ready to download it.
As Dan, as you're talking about it and you're describing their character in depth and the character that they have. Yeah. I've got a visual image here, and I always talk about this with Corey. Is my brain works that way. As you're telling a story, I'm trying to piece it together, and I know what your guy looks like. All right, I've got him here in my head. And the name of the book is Someone to Watch Over Me, and that's been out for a few months. It's on Amazon right now. You're going to tell more of these stories, I know it, at the Bear Valley Cultural Arts Center as they get together on October 23rd. What else are they going to try and pull from you on the 23rd?
Oh, I would imagine they'll have want to hear stories about stars I've worked with. That's always a hot topic. I've worked with Bruce Willis, which is an interesting experience.
Okay. Keyword, interesting.
I know what that is. Interesting. Yeah. It's like when I used to deal with pro athletes. I would use the word interesting for certain athletes. Yeah.
Oh, well, let me tell you about Bruce. I had written an action film called Blood Money for Disney. And one of the characters is this alcoholic ex-cop who runs a bar. And he's forced to, this tough FBI woman, straight by the book, the first woman ever to head up an FBI office, has to team up with him. And it's not a match made in heaven. We first see this guy where you hear him. You're close on a hand, and you see someone with some tiddlywinks, and he pops it, and it goes flying, and it falls right into the bodice of this opulently endowed young woman. He's in his bar. He's drunk as can be, and he's playing. This is not something that goes over big with Sullivan, the FBI woman that he has to work with. He's this outrageous character. And he shows up, I think it's 2 hours late for his meeting at the FBI. And he's berated by Sullivan. And what kind of restrictions do we have on language we can use?
We want to keep it clean. Yeah.
Okay. He says, I'm like blank, blank, blank. Dracula. I don't get up until the sun goes down. That's my friend John McTiernan, as a matter of fact. At any rate, Bruce loved it. It was submitted to him as a writing sample. And he was trying to do a remake of Humphrey Bogart's In a Lonely Place, one of the great film noirs of all time. And they hired me. So I go in for my first meeting. He's making Moonlighting at the time. I'm directed to his trailer. And as I arrive, the door opens and out comes Janet Jones, who later was a rising star, married Wayne Gretzky. Dan, I want you to meet my dear friend, Janet Jones. And then we go in, and he says, I want to be the next Humphrey Bogart. And okay, humble man, ambitious man. Anyhow, we would have story meetings at his home up in the Hollywood Hills, where he had a rock band, and he'd be playing. He'd had all his retinue, including his brother, around him, and our story meetings. And he'd be playing his own music on this massive console. These speakers bigger than I am, and I could see his mouth move. I knew he was talking, but I couldn't hear a word that he was saying. And the interesting thing was, he was forced to move out to Malibu. His neighbors were not fond of him and the parties that he threw. When we were alone, he was extremely articulate, intelligent, serious about his career and about the script. And yet, when we were with other people, one more person entered the room, he was playing the character on Moonlighting. He was playing Bruce Willis. It's true of a lot of actors.
Wow.
Particularly true of him in those days. I have no idea what he's like now. At any rate, it didn't have a happy ending. We conferred on everything. They approved everything that I was going to do. I turned in the script. The head of his company said, this is the best first draft I've ever received in all my years of work. And then they didn't like it. Why didn't they like it? Well, Bruce had just done a show business story with a female sidekick, and it failed at the box office. Mm-hmm. Well, what were we doing? This was about a screenwriter, and there's an affair with I'm trying to remember if she's an actress or not. I don't recall. It's been so many years. And it was very close. So it wasn't that he'd made a bad movie. He'd just chosen the wrong subject. So suddenly my script was no good. And I later encountered him again. My friend McTiernan, whose first film I did get made, called me up and said, okay, I've had to cast Bruce Willis in Die Hard. What's it like to work with him? So I told him, get him alone, get him aside from everyone else, and you'll really be able to talk turkey with him. Well, John invites me and my wife out to the set, and they're shooting the climax of Die Hard, and I see Bruce over across the room talking to Joel Silver, who's the producer of the film. Now, I'd met Joel many times. Met him down in Mexico when Arnold Schwarzenegger John was shooting Arnold Schwarzenegger in Predator. Well, I met him at the studio first. I'm talking in John's office, and I hear someone screaming and using he would have made Mark Twain blush with the language he was using. I said, "Who's that?" I said, "Joel." I said, "Who's he talking to?" He said, "Maria Shriver," Arnold's wife. And then he added, and Arnold hasn't signed his contract yet. You want to meet him? I said, "God, no." Come on. So I go in to meet him, and he's got his retinue, and John says, "Joel, I want you to meet my good friend, Dan Bronson." I put my hand out, and he just looks at it and continues his conversation with his retinue. Well, this time, however, he's over there talking to Bruce, and it turns out, I found out later what he was saying. Bruce was saying to him, "What's that guy doing here? He hates my guts." I'd struck fear into the heart of Bruce Willis. He knew how badly he treated me.
Yeah.
And didn't he, the whole Die Hard story was, right, wasn't Sinatra supposed to be John McClane or something crazy like that? And then they sort of reluctantly went, well, we got this. He's really not an action star, but let's plug in Bruce Willis, and then the rest is, franchise history.
I can't tell you. I don't know about that.
Yeah.
But here's the kicker. Joel comes over right after he talks to Bruce, and John's wife says, "Joel, I'd like you to meet Dan Bronson." "Dan, how the hell are you?" Well, I was important enough to have struck fear into Bruce Willis's heart, so I was important enough to be acknowledged. Hooray for Hollywood.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, my gosh. Well, the stories are going to continue on October 23rd at 4 p.m. at the Oak Tree Country Club in Bear Valley. It's going to be a part of the BVS Cultural Arts program. It's a special program they're going to be running that night. You're going to be there, and are you going to be able to field questions from the audience?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So it's going to be a back and forth. You'll be able to talk about your books, the stories. We've only scratched the surface of what you're going to get into, and you'll be able to be as colorful as you need to be in describing in some of these stories. I hate to restrict you, but I have promised that everything to be a clean program that we produce.
I got to ask this because we've seen, since you've been, your time in Hollywood, different era, but you're still obviously kind of in tune. What we see now with, you brought up earlier with the streaming, and there's a lot of content coming out, whether it's Netflix, Hulu's got originals, and a lot of these things they're picking up from other people. Amazon got its own studio. Apple has its own studio now. So there's a lot of stuff coming out. Some of it is actually really good that maybe would never have gotten touched by a traditional studio. Some of it's just, terrible, and it's just we need to fill something. Let's get a series out there. So your thoughts about what we see now, from going from the traditional sort of movie studios to now everybody seems to have their own production company and distribution network.
Well, it's a very different world. As a matter of fact, in my day, there was this chasm between television and the movies. Mm-hmm. And if you were a screenwriter for movies and you crossed over to television, you couldn't go back. Today, It's a freeway, back and forth between the two worlds. It's also, in my day, the writer was like the lowest guy on the totem pole. He had no control over his own work. Today, the writer as showrunner with these limited series is the top dog. He's in charge. So I think it's a great time to be a writer in Hollywood. There's so much production, so much product that are putting out there, that it's quite wonderful. Yeah, and I don't know how long it'll last. I mean, whenever something new comes along, there's this great sense of freedom, and there's this great rush of creativity, and then things become more and more controlled, and a lot of that disappears. But I think we're still there, and we're getting a lot of good stuff.
Mm-hmm. And we're getting a lot of stuff from overseas too that's coming in that whether it gets dubbed over again. I know like top on Netflix right now is the Squid Game, and this was written in Korea 9 years ago and finally produced, and it's a huge hit. It's kind of odd. I think I started watching just what's the buzz about it. I watched like the first episode, and I'm like, I don't know if I'm going to go to the next couple, but I kind of get it now. So,
it's very violent. I haven't watched it, but I've read a lot about it.
Yeah. But there's a lot of that stuff too. You've got a lot of international stuff coming in because of the need for content right now.
Well, and you look at in the workplace now in the motion picture industry, and is the potential of work stoppage based on a lot with streaming and trying to monetize streaming.
So much demand on the workforce.
Right. And there are people saying, hey, you haven't come to the table for us, and you're looking at that backside. Those behind the scenes are saying, hey, you're making an awful lot of money on that front end, and it's not coming back and being evenly distributed or being distributed adequately for us. So, I mean, we're looking at a work stoppage, in the industry. I mean, it's funny how we talk about streaming and it gives all these new levels of exposure for product, but then you're looking at also, once again, at the studios figuring out how they've monetized it, but they've control all the money in the game.
Well, maybe we can end at the beginning. My transition from the academic world to the world of Hollywood. I arrived in Hollywood obsessed with film art, film as the greatest art form ever because it combines all the arts. And I was almost immediately set straight. My new friend, the story editor at Universal, he says, Dan, they call it the film business. It's not the film art. Movies is money. Movies is money. And of course, the corollary is greed is good as far as the studios are concerned. And they try to hang on to as much of it as they can. And that's what Amazon and Hulu and all of the others are becoming, studios. So I think the past patterns will reassert themselves eventually. But in the meantime, we're getting some pretty good stuff.
Yeah.
Now, can you watch reality TV?
No.
That's kind of what I thought. But I had to ask you.
I think when it first started, then it became, what do they call it now? Unscripted dramas, because, well, it's actually scripted. Anyway, it got off the rails many years ago,
Well, and now, of course, the Writers Guild has contracts
Yeah.
with people doing so-called reality TV.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Well, these are just a few of the stories that Dan is going to share and that can expand upon and answer your questions if you'd like. It's going to be at the BVS Cultural Arts. They are putting together this program on October 23rd at 4 p.m. in Bear Valley at the Oak Tree Country Club. If folks want to get more information on how to attend, can you tell us how they can do that?
I think we've got a phone number down there for
Michelle Miller at
Yes.
972-2519. That's in the 661 area code, or Jeanette Roy at 661-972-2344, and they can assist you with getting a gate pass to get into Bear Valley and get you more information on how to attend. So that should be a fun event. You never know. You might see Corey and I in the audience asking another follow-up question to something that we've asked you today, Dan.
And Dan's website is dan-bronson.com, Bronson. And, of course, those books that we talked about, Someone to Watch Over Me and Confessions of a Hollywood Nobody, are available on Amazon. So I'm actually going to download both of them because I want to learn more.
Great.
Dan, thank you for taking the time to come in. One more question before we go. What brought you to Tehachapi?
Oh, the rural setting, the wilderness all around where we live in Bear Valley, the wildlife. I'm a backpacker. I've been backpacking for 25 years. And in all those years, I don't think I have seen altogether as many animals as I see, and birds, as I see in one day in Bear Valley. I mean, it's amazing. We've got a cougar in the area right now. We've got 3 different bears. We've got everything else from the smallest to the largest. I'm thrilled by it, and I'm thrilled by the views. We sit on a ridge and can see for 100 miles when there's no smoke.
Yeah.
I just love it, and I love the community. I mean, it's a tight knit community. It's still possible to walk into a store and be greeted by your name. Where does that happen anymore? Yeah. We're an urban society today, and the places like Tehachapi are far and few between. So, yeah, I love it here.
Very true.
Fantastic.
Well, it's Dan Bronson. He's been our guest today here on Tehachapod. Dan, thank you so much for taking the time and coming in and sharing some of your Hollywood stories with us. We appreciate it. Corey and I get to be, kind of the kids going, ooh, and we can kind of fill in some blanks where you had to leave some things off.
I was like, I was an HBO generation kid, right? HBO came out when cable first came to Tehachapi, and HBO was a thing. And so seeing movies, oftentimes over and over again. But yeah, I mean, that was kind of what I grew up with. And I was kind of that first sort of movie generation, and that movies were a thing to do as you grew up in Tehachapi, especially. There's nothing else going on. Go to Blockbuster or go to the local video store back then and pick a movie, and your friends come over, and that transitioned into college too for the longest time until. So that was part of the upbringing was movies is just something to do.
Well, you'll be pleased to know that I am permanently blacklisted by HBO.
There's another story.
That's another story. Well, maybe we'll have another session one of these days, and I'll explain that one to you.
Blacklisted. It's wow. Dan Bronson.
Yeah, that's right.
You're not blacklisted from our show, though.
Yeah.
And if you'd like to get more information about Dan or the books that he has written, you can go to dan-bronson.com, or you can just search Dan Bronson on Amazon. Both the books will pop up. Dan, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. We just appreciate you coming in and look forward to having another conversation in the future.
Great.
Corey, anything we want to end wrapping up? We've covered a lot of historic Hollywood here.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that we can talk about it to someone who lives here in Tehachapi.
Yeah, and this is a perfect example of what we have in Tehachapi, the people, and this is what this podcast is really a part about too, is bringing the stories out of Tehachapi. We don't know what is, in our own community and the experiences and the life experiences people have, and that's what's great about it, is there are a million other stories out there, and we want to try to get to as many as possible, and a lot of fascinating individuals.
Backstories are what makes this show what it is.
Absolutely.
And we appreciate the time everyone invests listening to our show. Tell a friend. We'd appreciate that as the show continues to grow. We just appreciate the time that everyone takes to download each of these episodes. Tell a friend about Tehachapod. Send us your show thoughts and ideas. If there's something you'd like us to talk about, send it to media@TehachapiCityHall.com. We'll be happy to try and get that on for you, and we appreciate your time. Gentlemen, thanks once again. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Tehachapod is a conversation about Tehachapi designed for the people who live here or who would like to know more about this mountaintop community. If you have a question you would like answered, email media@TehachapiCityHall.com. We will try to answer it on a future episode of Tehachapod.